Hi everyone, this is Phil Travis. This week's lesson is on a new age of affluence in post-war Europe, particularly Western Europe, which by the 1950s, late 1950s and 1960s, Europe experienced really an economic recovery of stunning proportions, especially when we consider the fact that Europe had in 1945 been utterly devastated. And of course, before 1945, European economies were also generally associated with stagnation in the context of the Depression. And so the recovery to this new age of affluence that we really see take hold in the 1960s is really quite incredible. Europeans, uh, Western Europeans developed new, robust consumer economies, began traveling more, had new high-tech appliances and automobiles, and so forth. And so Europe has a sort of economic revival that was quite shocking in the speed in which it occurred. So there's a number of factors in Europe's recovery. Um, the ingredients for this recovery are things like an increased worldwide trade, um, continental integration. With the Rome Treaty, of course, we began to see the development of the European Economic Community, but it should be noted that integration, meaning the integration of the national, states and economies of Europe, that integration had been going on for quite some time before the Rome Treaty. Um, so a big factor in this recovery is increasing integration of European nations in a more regional economic arrangement, increasing trade between European countries, increasing movement of laborers from European countries. Um, so integrating, moving away from the sort of nationally dominated economics of the pre-war period of the imperial age and a movement towards regional integration, the interconnection of European nations in the post-war period is also a factor in this robust European economic recovery. We also have robust government spending, progressive taxation, and limited wage increases. And in connection with the limited wage increases, a growing and productive labor sector. So we have kind of an agreement within many of these states that they have an agreement of the welfare state, of social democracies, that the government should spend to provide for basic necessities, should tax to make those provisions. And, workers did not receive tremendous wage increases, but they had, many of their sort of necessities were being now cared for by the welfare state. So public transportation, public broadcasting, healthcare, these types of things were things that most people of these societies bought into. And so an ingredient for this economic recovery is a robust government spending, not only in the welfare state programs, but also in the economies. Progressive taxation to fund this. And then, of course, a very productive labor force, a growing labor force, and limited wage increases for that labor force. There's a population growth in Europe. Europe, like in the United States, experiences its own sort of baby boom. There's a young growing population across Europe, and this is a big factor. And one of the reasons for this, of course, was improved nutrition, availability of things like milk, improved nutrition for the people. But this population growth ultimately facilitates an economic recovery as there's a robust workforce and there's a growing amount of people able to consume products. The European recovery was also fueled by cheap labor, migrant labor. There's sort of like two broad areas that I would say the migrant labor was coming from in many of these cases. Migrant labor came from the greater Mediterranean region, and so in this respect, I would just say, southeastern Europe, Areas like Turkey, for example, Eastern Europe to some degree, were all very important in the migrant labor needs of Western Europe. Italians, for example, worked in the tourism industry in the Swiss Alps, and they were not well-paid jobs. They were seasonal jobs. They were jobs that did not reap the benefits of the welfare state, and they were sort of, easy hire, easy fire type jobs. There's a huge amount of Italian migrants. Of course, there's many migrants from other areas of southeastern Europe and of Turkey that ultimately migrate to Europe to work in various migratory types of labor industries. And then the other big group is from former colonies. And the former colonies, in the case of, like, for example, Great Britain, certainly it created a sort of social crisis in Great Britain. Great Britain's empire had, of course, been decolonized, and increasing members of that empire were gaining independence, and most of these areas, of course, were in the Caribbean, Africa, and, of course, in India. And these individuals were seen largely as non-white by people in Great Britain, and many people in Great Britain and in other European countries defined their nation in part as a white nation. And so we see in Great Britain a sort of crisis of race, the issue of race and citizenship, where many Britons, not all of them, of course, were, defining Britain, traditional Britain as around whiteness. And they saw people that were non-white as a threat to the traditional makeup of the British citizenry. And so this is a real crisis in Great Britain, a crisis that deals with the issue of race and citizenship, issues that the United States has also dealt with, as well as other countries have dealt with. Race is, of course, a construct. It's a made-up thing, made up by pseudoscientists, basically, during the imperial age. And race has often been a tool to control citizenship and effectively repress people's, rights. So race has often been a manner in which certain countries and certain groups have constructed the notion of citizenship, and along with that notion of citizenship, the rights to equality in society. And we see a crisis over race and citizenship in many European countries as a result of migrant labor, particularly in the 60s, migrant labor from non-white areas, particularly areas formerly part of the empire. In Great Britain, this leads to the passage of legislation designed to restrict the migration of peoples from non-white places. And of course, we see similar legislation was passed in the United States during the 20s, of course. In Great Britain, you had race riots and race protests, if you will, and so you had a real crisis in Great Britain over the issue of race and citizenship. And you have this crisis in other European countries as well. In Great Britain, while you have restricted immigration measures adopted designed to restrict immigration from non-white places, you do simultaneously, or around about the same time, have the passage of measures that were meant to prevent discrimination within Great Britain. So there are measures taken in Great Britain to prevent discrimination against non-white people, while simultaneously, more or less, there are measures taken to restrict the arrival of new non-white people. So if you were in Great Britain, or you were able to migrate into Great Britain, and you were non-white, you would be protected by anti-discriminatory laws. But your ability to get to Great Britain, particularly after the early 1970s, was limited to an extent by the laws passed by the government as increasingly the country sort of struggled with the issue of race and citizenship. So we just looked at the ingredients, sort of the factors that played into this incredibly robust economic recovery in Europe, and some of the problems there too. Now, let's look at the symptoms. So the symptoms of the European recovery is really a fundamental, and we see this as well, it should be noted, we see these parallels in the United States as well in some cases. So what are the symptoms? What are the sort of results of this newfound affluent and advanced European recovery? The symptoms are things actually that in some respects you might just look at this new technology, right? The washing machines, the refrigerators, and cars. And we might say, oh, that's very interesting, and that's a very interesting change. They had more money, they could buy more things. But these things actually change Europe on a more fundamental level. And the same thing for the United States. When we look at television, television, even though television was very primitive in this period, in the late 50s and 60s, television, for example, tended to be very, very sanitized, very controlled, government, public television, only aired for a few hours a day. They would have some limited programs. They generally tried to avoid, shall we say, suggestive sort of topics. There was only 2 channels in many cases. So television was itself in a very, very it's very kind of early stages of its development. Whereas today, of course, you have, television in Europe, you have Sky and, really robust public television in places like Great Britain, as well as numerous cable television options. But nonetheless, even though television was, highly primitive in the late 50s and early 60s in Europe, it became an increasing commodity, and just like in the United States, it really revolutionized European society. Television really resulted in a recreation of national culture and also the creation of youth culture. Whereas before, people kind of were exposed from their culture, at various types of events, folk events, a circus, or these types of things. Increasingly, television brought a cultural sort of communication right into people's homes, and instead, this new sort of world of television shaped and created national culture, whereas before. And we see this again also in the United States. People tended to identify more regionally than nationally within their own country. But television ultimately, really creates a national culture where Frenchness or Germanness or Britishness is something that is conveyed through the medium of television. And all people in France and Germany and Britain or the United States are sort of participating in these same products. In Europe, sort of advertised commercial television, I should say, began, I think, in 1955. It was the first, but ultimately, it will take on in other countries as well. Television transformed politics, not only in Europe. Again, this is a parallel we see in America. The transformation of politics. Politics, because of the television, went from being something that was really more elite, with sort of stuffy politicians that you never saw. You might hear them on the radio. Television moved from that sort of unseen to politics that people viewed in their domestic hearth, if you will. The television took politics from elitism to the sort of domestic home, and brought political leaders and candidates and political messages and so forth through the television right inside into people's homes. And of course, this meant that people's persona increasingly mattered, how people perceived them, how people handled themselves visually very much mattered. In addition, the television was a new medium of political communication that powerful political entities would try to control and manipulate and use to advance their political agendas. And of course, we see that increasingly common here in the 21st century. The radio, of course, is abundant. The transistor very much revolutionizes the radio, the emergence of transistor radios, which meant that this medium was increasingly common as well. American pop culture music, television, as well as the development of long play records and these types of things. The commodification of popular music from the United States, much of it blues-based, African American blues-based music, very much factors into, along with the television, creating a youth culture, a rock and roll culture, particularly in Great Britain, where we see, of course, the British invasion, groups like the Beatles. By the late 60s, of course, Led Zeppelin, which, of course, both the Beatles and Led Zeppelin and groups like the Rolling Stones were the most famous rock groups of all time. I mean, still to this day, these groups are hugely popular, and they sell a tremendous amount of albums, or digital albums, I suppose, more commonly today, but than ever before. And so this is American blues music being sort of consumed by a more affluent youth culture, particularly in Great Britain, and being transformed and commodified and first introduced in rock and roll venues across the UK. And then, of course, many of the most popular groups coming across to the United States and really making their break in the United States. And thereby not only transforming, British culture, but also British youth rock culture, if you will, but also transforming American, or playing a role in transforming American youth identity as well. So television and music and rock and roll, the ability to commodify these mediums, if you will, is very, very critical in the creation of national identity, and as well as also the creation of youth identity. Youth identity did not exist before this period, both in the United States or in Europe. There was really no such thing as a youth identity. You were a child until you left school and got a job, and then you were an adult. After the post-war years in both the United States and Europe, you see young people staying in school longer, going to college, and creating and forming through music, through the radio, and through the television, and their role in higher education, forming sort of a unique sort of youth identity, which was often associated with various pop culture mediums like rock and roll. We see the emergence of important household appliances like refrigerators and washing machines. The washing machine caught on a little more slowly, largely because there was still, in many countries, there was still an inordinate amount of people without running water in this period. But these types of technologies revolutionize life for Europeans. The automobile was huge as well. Europeans before the war years generally were regional in how they moved about, or local, I should say, really actually local. Europeans tended to use public transportation, and they tended to travel very little. I mean, at least non-elite. Certainly, the aristocratic, peoples would have been traveling extensively for many, many years. But for everyday people, long-distance recreation and travel was really not a thing that was done. But with the automobile, we see increasingly in the late 50s and 60s, we see increasingly the creation of efficient, low-cost automobiles produced in mass by corporations like BMW, in the British Motor Corporation in Great Britain, Fiat, Renault, Citroën, begin to produce cars that were actually modeled in a lot of ways after the ideal of the Model T, Henry Ford's Model T, which of course was the idea of creating practical, efficient, low-cost automobiles. And this resulted in really a revolution of not only automaking in production in Europe with cars like the Mini, but also with a new type of recreational life that was now possible for Europeans, as Europeans could now get in their car and drive somewhere and see the country and go to events and so forth. So the automobile, like also in the United States, increasingly transformed life for Europeans. There's also a tremendous growth in service sector jobs. We have an increasing movement of Europeans from the countryside to towns and cities, and likewise we have an increasing amount of young people taking jobs in the in the broadly termed area, the service sector. So these are the symptoms of this incredible European recovery. So one last area that I want to talk about is with respects to automobiles, and particularly the success of West Germany's automobiles industry and the failure of Great Britain's automobile and manufacturing industry. Um, in the post-war period, um, European manufacturers kind of bought into the idea of Henry Ford's Model T, that you could manufacture a practical, feasible, inexpensive car that could be, consumed and used by Europeans and could be imported and sold all over all of the European continent. And this idea very much caught on, was highly successful. Initially, the British were at the forefront of manufacturing in the late 40s and 50s. Early on, the British economy was ahead really of the economies of countries like Germany. However, eventually we see by the 1970s really the failure of the British automobile manufacturing industry, and we see the emergence of the German automobile manufacturing industry as really second to none. Today, we regard German automobile manufacturers as really the zenith, most people do, of quality in automotive manufacture. On the cutting edge of technology and quality, German manufacturing of cars is pretty widely revered. Whereas by comparison, the British manufacturing sector um, has failed. It was one time robust, but today there really is no truly national British manufacturing automobile corporation to speak of. There are still cars manufactured in Great Britain, and there are, specialty cars and things like this, exotic cars that are manufactured there. And there are foreign companies that manufacture cars there, but there is no British car company anymore. It used to be the British Motor Corporation, which then became Leland Motors, was bought out, and eventually it was ultimately purchased by BMW. As these corporations failed. And, the reason for the success of the West German automobile industry and the failure of the British is certainly complicated, but is down to a number of straightforward issues. In Germany, Germany had a robust sort of business infrastructure in place that, was relatively intact at the end of World War II. The business infrastructure in Germany was a product of the militarization that occurred in the 1930s. And of course, that infrastructure was put in place to tool for war. But 20 years later, it's used to create a very robust automobile manufacturing infrastructure. Germany also had access to resources that the British suffered a lack of because of the collapse of the British Empire. Germany did not have an empire, and they were on the continent with greater access to resources, and so they weren't as affected by this. Great Britain, the loss of the British Empire, the loss of its colonies following decolonization very much affected Great Britain's economic health. Britain is an island dependent on imports, and the loss of cheap resources from its empire very much affected the health of its automobile manufacturing. In addition, the British philosophy early on was to focus more on quantity than quality, and so as a result of this, British automobile manufacturers produced a huge quantity of really inferior automobiles. They weren't well built or designed or reliable. And this in the long term was really will create an exodus of customers from abroad, from for example the continent. It would cause an exodus of customers as customers lost faith in the quality of the product that British car companies were making, and they gained loyalty in the product of continental car manufacturers. And so the belief in quantity over quality in the British manufacturing and the acceptance of more shoddy production was something that was ultimately very damning for the British Motor Corporation and its successor, Leland. Other factors, of course, the government in Great Britain was less eager to sort of prop up the British Motor Corporation for as long as you would find in the case of companies like Fiat in Italy or Renault in France. And so that also, the attitude of the government also mattered. The British business infrastructure was more atomized, and it was not as robust as the German infrastructure. Great Britain suffered from a great deal of debts in the post-war period that, because of the nature of Reconstruction in Germany, were not similarly problematic for the West German government. And so as a result of these factors, the British Motor Company really collapses, and its major corporations are bought out, particularly by companies like BMW, and that leads today to the sort of reality that Great Britain was once a revered and robust automobile manufacturer, and today it really is no longer relevant in that area, whereas Germany in its recovery created really the most robust automotive manufacturing infrastructure or automobile manufacturing reputation in the world. And this was all due really to the realities of the post-war, to the realities of decolonization, of debt from war, and of government attitudes with respects to the automobile industry, as well as the philosophy of automakers. All right, guys, hope this is helpful. Let's have a great week, and let me know if you have any questions.